This lecture is about the Old Testament law. And let's just give you a little general information about the Old Testament law. There's 5 different books in the Pentateuch that we would call the law. The book of Genesis, which is about the beginnings of Israel, and likewise the beginnings of the world. The book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Exodus is about the Exodus from Egypt and also the giving of the law. And we're familiar with the 20th chapter of Exodus, which contains the 10 Commandments. The book of Leviticus has laws which relate to the Levitical tribe or the Levites. And the book of Numbers gives us the history of the wanderings in the wilderness. And we have a numbering of Israel at the beginning of the book and a numbering of Israel at the end of the book, at the beginning of the 40 years and at the end of the 40 years. And the book of Deuteronomy is a repetition of the law before they march on into the land of Canaan. And the law was given at Mount Sinai, also called Mount Horeb, which is down near the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, in the Old Testament, these specific commands are not binding on Christians today, but the principles of righteousness that the law reveals in the moral part of the law is things that are unchanging, and they are still valid today. The Old Testament does emphasize the dignity of labor. It emphasizes personal rights to personal property. It emphasizes the necessity of a blood sacrifice for sins, and it demands, of course, good moral behavior. In Exodus chapter 20, we have the 10 Commandments. It's also repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. It's also known as the Decalogue. This part of the Old Testament was personally inscribed by God. And outside of this, the only words we have in the Bible that are actually inscribed by God would be the words written on the walls of Belshazzar's feast that was interpreted by Daniel. But other than that, we have nothing else that was personally written by God. These 10 Commandments were later placed in the Ark of the Covenant, the 2 tables of stone. And after Moses broke those, then he goes back up the mountain and they are written out again. The 10 Commandments have 8 negatives. Thou shalt not. And there's 8 of those. And there are 2 positives. Thou shalt, anyway, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and honor thy father and thy mother would be the 2 positive ones. And there's 4 of them that relate to God, and there are 6 of them that relate to man, of what we're not supposed to do. Slavery was in the Old Testament. It says in the Old Testament that a slave would serve 6 years, and the 7th year they would go out free. And a person became a slave if they went bankrupt. But it wasn't a lifelong thing, because they would be freed that 7th year. Debtors were sold into slavery. God also was deeply concerned about the poor people, and another provision he had for the poor was the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, a person got their property back if they had lost it due to debt. All debts were cleared. Property went back to the original family line. And naturally, if a person sold their property in the 45th year, the person who bought the property would only have 5 years of use out of it. So the value would deteriorate over time. God also gave another provision for the poor. They were able to glean in the fields, and when the harvesters had gone through, then a poor person had the right to go in and get anything that was left in order to live. In relationship to crime, there were 3 areas in which there was prescribed the death penalty. We can put it this way: it was the sanctity of life, the sanctity of the family, and reverence for God. There was the death penalty for murder, and there was also the death penalty for adultery or kidnapping. You could even take rebellious children to the authorities, and they would be put to death. The parents did have to throw the first stone and make the accusation. We do not know that that ever happened. But you certainly didn't have the children calling the law on their parents. That would be for sure. And likewise, for blasphemy, that would be the death penalty, or anything that was not properly reverent for God. One person in the book, in the law, was stoned to death for picking up sticks upon the Sabbath day, for example. For crimes against property, there was restitution, and restitution would also be done for carelessness. There was a provision made for a fair trial, and it was necessary to have 2 or 3 witnesses to convict an individual. One of the major purposes of the Old Testament was to make provision for somebody that had sinned, and there are several offerings given in the Old Testament. There's actually 5 different types of offerings, and I'm not going to discuss most of those, but the sin offering was a sacrifice that had to be made for a person's sins to be atoned. And likewise, there must also be a sacrifice for the trespass offering, which is for an intentional offender, and you also had to make restitution. The high point of the offerings occurred on the Great Day of Atonement, one of the Jewish feasts, and on that day, the high priest would enter into the tabernacle alone, and he would sacrifice an offering for his own sin, and then he would make a sacrifice of the sins for the people. He would enter into the Holy of Holies, the one time of the year that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, and there he would sprinkle blood to make an atonement for the sins of the nation, as well as for his own sins. It was the high point of the Jewish year as far as what they did. And you also had a goat that would be sacrificed, and his blood would be taken for that, and a second goat that the sin would be placed on. He's called the scapegoat, and that one would be sent away into the wilderness. As far as Jewish feasts are concerned, there were 7 feasts that were set up in the law for the Jewish people. I'm not going to mention all of those. 3 of those are in the spring time of the year. 3 of those are in the fall. 1 of those is in the summer. But 3 times the Jewish people were to gather together. The Jewish men were to gather together and come and have their feast. Now, their feast may actually be fasting, but it would really be a Jewish festival. We might put it that way. There are 3 of those where the men were to gather together: the Passover, which occurs in the spring, the day of Pentecost, which occurs in the summer, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs in the fall. The Passover, that feast, it represented Jesus Christ, of course, as we've talked about, and how that the Lamb made a provision so that the death angel would not strike. God gave instructions to Moses on how to build the tabernacle in which they were to worship God, and just simply a few things about the tabernacle. You have a large courtyard, and inside of that courtyard, as you would come into the courtyard, the first article of furniture would be the brazen altar. And it was right here that fire was kept burning, and there is a grate on this altar, and the sacrifices would be laid on that grate, and there they would be burned. And of course, the sacrifice there represents God's sacrifice for sin. Before we can approach God any further, our sin must be atoned for. It represents salvation in the first work of grace. As you progress through the tabernacle courtyard, the next article you would come to would be the laver. It was a bowl that contained water in it, and every time that the priest went beyond that point, going toward the tabernacle, they were to wash themselves, and it represented cleansing, the second work of grace. Then you would come to the holy place and the Holy of Holies, a building that it was the square type building, actually a rectangular type building. The holy place, the priests are going to go in there every day, making their sacrifices. As you would enter into the holy place, over to the right would be the table of showbread. 12 loaves of bread were placed on the table of showbread each week, each one representing the 12 tribes of Israel, also representing Jesus Christ as the bread of life. To our left, there would be the candlestick, the golden candlestick that provided the only light in the tabernacle, and it likewise represents Jesus Christ as the light of the world. Straight ahead of a person, and just before the veil, which would be the back part of the holy place, would be the altar of incense. And incense, which represents prayer, was kept burning continually as it ascended heavenward. And Jesus Christ, our great intercessor, is in heaven today making intercession for us. There is a veil or a curtain, we would say, that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Behind that veil, you had one article of furniture, and that is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant had placed within it 3 articles. You had the tables of the law, which had the 10 commandments. You had Aaron's rod, which budded, and you had a pot of manna. The top of the Ark of the Covenant is called the mercy seat. It was made out of pure gold. And on either side of the mercy seat, there was a cherubim overshadowing the mercy seat. The most holy article of furniture for the Jewish people was the Ark of the Covenant. And the top of it, the mercy seat, was where the blood was to be sprinkled. And it was represented the place where God met with the people. I might mention that no one was allowed into the Holy of Holies except the high priest. But when Jesus Christ died, that veil was rent from top to bottom. And as the book of Hebrews says, thus signifying that that way was now made, that we could now go in. And it said, let us therefore, brethren, boldly enter into the holiest by a new and a living way. The children of Israel were to be a separated people, and things were distinguished to be clean or unclean. And animals were broken down into that category, and they were not allowed to eat unclean animals. And for animals such as livestock, it had to have split hooves and to chew its cud. Now, these animals are all listed out individually. Fish must have fins and scales. Insects must be those that would leap, such as your locusts or your grasshoppers. And the birds could not be a scavenger type bird, such as no vultures, buzzards, eagles, hawks, or that type could be eaten. Those would be the clean and the unclean. The priestly line was the family of Aaron, and they were the descendants of Aaron were to be the high priests. The tribe was the tribe of Levi that was to assist in all of the aspects of the priestliness. Well, how does the Old Testament relate to us today? Let me mention this, that we're to keep all of the principles, but not necessarily the specific commands. The Old Testament law was written to the Jewish people in a specific culture and at a specific time. However, I want to say that we're under the principles of the Old Testament because the principles of right and wrong never change, since they are based upon the character of God. A second reason why we would be under the principles is because God gave these principles and God gave these commands for the benefit of the people. It wasn't to hurt them, it was to help them. You know, we can think of laws today that, for example, back in the Old Testament, they had a law that said you had to put a railing around the roof of your house. We certainly do not do that today. That would seem rather ridiculous. But their house, the top of it was their porch. They spent a lot of time on the roof of their house. And so a railing needed to be there to protect them. We do the same thing when we have a deck or a porch. If there's much of a drop-off, we're required to have a railing around it. And it's the same principle simply applied in our culture today, and yet slightly different. I might mention there are several different types of laws in the Old Testament. There is not only the moral law that we're still under, there is also the ceremonial law. We do not consider ourselves under the ceremonial law. And one of the main reasons for that is it was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He is our sacrifice. And in one sense, we can say that it's kept through Jesus Christ, but we do not go around making offerings today in the same way. You also have cultural laws. I mentioned the law about the rooftop. That's a cultural code. We would not say that we're under the exact same cultural codes. We just simply keep those same principles. There likewise would be laws that would relate to government, the civil law. And while there's a lot of things we can learn about the way that the law should be operated, I would not suggest that we're under the same exact civil laws or governmental laws that the Jewish people are. For one thing, we're not running the government. If we were, we should look a little more seriously at some of the principles that you have in the Old Testament. The New Testament is different. The New Testament was written for all people of all time. And I would not suggest that it changes by culture. If we have a specific command in the New Testament, it needs to be kept. We also would keep the principles of the New Testament as well as the specific commands of the New Testament. Now, the moral law, another reason why we are under the moral law is the moral law, as a basic rule, is repeated in the New Testament. We have the Old Covenant, we have the New Covenant, or we could call them the Old Testament and the New Testament. We are under the New Testament, and the Bible says that we are not under the law, referring to the Old Testament law. But the covenant that God gave to us, that is still in force. And almost everything from the Old Testament is repeated in the New Testament. There's only two laws that we would go back to the Old Testament for that I really know of. And those two things is we go back to the Old Testament on the question about the Lord's Day or the Sabbath day and keeping that. We do believe that we keep that day, the Lord's Day. Likewise, we go back to the Old Testament in regards to women's apparel. I'm going to deal with those two issues specifically, explaining why we would still use those Old Testament principles to apply to us today. A third thing we would look at is the definition of sin varies between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it is very clear that any breaking of the law is called sin. It doesn't matter whether it was done ignorantly or whether it was done intentionally. The penalty was stronger if it was done intentionally, but both were considered sin. But the New Testament has a completely different look at it. It is not sin in a legal sense. We would look at sin in a moral sense of disobedience to God. a knowledgeable breaking of God's law instead of an ignorant breaking of God's law. And so that definition of sin would vary. And we will discuss those next.